All right, guys, we're back again to go over Unit 3 review for the concepts there. So again, my goal here is not necessarily that you watch this entire video. It certainly wouldn't hurt, but it's going to be a pretty long one because I'm going over an entire unit of some pretty complex stuff. We're talking about money supply, we're talking about money markets, loanable funds markets, the Fed, monetary policy, all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot going on here. Again, when you see this video on YouTube, underneath in the description is going to be for each of the concepts a list of the times that I'm talking about those specific concepts. This is also going to be in the document as you get this particular document as a PDF. It's going to have those times as well. So again, if there's a specific topic that you're struggling with or trying to answer a question about or this or that and you just can't quite figure it out, you might want to go to that particular part to get a refresher on that, and that'd probably be helpful. But at any rate, let's go through. We're talking about money supply, just in the general sense. What we talk about M1 and M2, we've talked about that before. Bank balance sheets, your favorite. Money multiplier, it's not too bad. Money markets, loanable funds markets, we're going to go over those graphs. The Fed, what they do with monetary policy, and then of course we'll talk just a quick refresher on interest rates and how that affects long-term growth. So let's start with money supply, talking about, again, there's more than M1 and M2, but we're going to keep it as simple as possible. So before we even talk about M1 and M2, they both have to do with liquidity. So let's talk about this word liquidity. Liquidity essentially means how quickly an asset can get converted into cash, okay? So you think about it, the cash in your wallet, that's obviously 100% liquid. It is cash. A checking account is 100% liquid because you can have access to that at any time. Savings accounts and other types of accounts, those are a little bit less liquid. Money that you have in a retirement account, not very liquid at all, unless you want to pay big penalties, and still there's going to be a time lag between when you can get that money. The money you have tied up in a home, that's not very liquid either. You have to sell the home. That doesn't happen immediately. It takes time to get that money out. So that's kind of what the M1 and M2 have to do with. So like I said, M1 are the types of assets that are 100% liquid. You have access to them, can spend them as cash or as a medium of exchange at any time. And of course, that's cash and checkable deposits. And that's the most liquid. M2, which is the next level next level up, consists of, and this is important, M1 plus broader types of savings accounts that again you don't necessarily have access to immediately. You will very quickly, especially in today's electronic age, but there still might be some delay when you get that money. So things like savings accounts, CDs, money market funds, and whatnot. Again, they're pretty quick, but not quite so much. And again, I like this graphic. It's probably not as clear on here. Hopefully on the document that you have, it's a little bit clearer. But here you have M1, which is currency and checking accounts. They also put traveler's checks in there. Traveler's checks are rarely used anymore, but in theory that would be as well. And then again, you see how M2 encompasses M1 plus these other things. There is an M3, which is M1 and M2 plus things that are a little bit less liquid. So again, remember their favorite type of question, the one they ask over and over again. You probably, I'd say there's a good chance you're going to see maybe in a month from now. Bob has $1,000 in cash, which he deposits into his checking account at his bank. How did that change M1? Okay, and of course we know the answer. It does not change M1. It goes from cash to a checking account. They're both in M1 to begin with, and so it's the same thing. So again, just to think about it mathematically, just extend this a little bit. Remember, you have cash plus checking. If I can spell, there you go, should have thought this through, plus checking equals M1. So originally, he's got $1,000 in cash, nothing in his checking account, or maybe he's got something, but certainly not that money. And so M1 is going to equal 1,000. When he takes that cash, puts it into his checking account, now he has no cash, but he has a checking account worth $1,000. And M1 is, guess what, still $1,000. That's why there is no change to M1 as a result of that transaction. I'd love to ask that question. All right, let's talk about our bank balance sheet. So you love this one. So again, it's really not that bad. Try to keep it as simple as possible. You got the two sides, assets on one side, usually made up of reserves, Loans, sometimes they'll throw in things like property, things like that. Liabilities are typically deposits, okay, that's money that the bank owes to somebody else. So if you have your money in a bank, technically it's not their money, they owe it to you, so it's a liability. It could also be stockholders' equity, Fed loans, things like that. So bottom line is you got the two sides, of course, our golden rule. The two sides always have to balance, okay? So we'll get to that in a second, but first let's talk about the required reserve ratio here. So remember the required reserves, that's the percentage of deposits that banks must keep, okay? And that's important. It only applies to checkable deposits. Okay, when you put money in a bank, in your checking account, the government has to keep, the bank has to keep a portion of that. Okay, the rest of it, they can loan out, because that's how they make money off of your money, is by loaning it out. Okay, anything else though, if they were to list stockholders' equity, if they were to list loans from the Fed or loans from other banks or things like that, they can loan out 100% of that. They don't have to keep any portion of it. That's very important, because if you don't know, that's going to confuse you. Okay, so in this example, as it says down here, the reserve ratio must be 20%, okay? And the reason it's 20% is because there are $20,000 in deposits. Required, the banks have to keep 4,000 of that, so 4,000 divided by 20,000 is 0.2 or 20%, okay? So that's how you would know from looking at this that the reserve ratio has to be 20%. All right, now, when a new deposit or withdrawal is made, all right, and they give you a question, they say, okay, somebody puts money in or takes money out, what do you do? 3 steps, and do them in this order. If you do them in this order, you'll always get to the right answer, okay? So the first thing you want to do is make the adjustment to the deposit, okay? So if it's a deposit, you're going to add money to that amount. If it's a withdrawal, you're going to subtract money. So up here, and you're going to see this in a second, they have $20,000 in deposits. If somebody comes and puts more money in the bank, this number is going to increase. If somebody makes a withdrawal, this number is going to decrease. Do that first. The second thing you do, okay, after you do that, is then figure out the new amount of required reserves. So how much, okay, based on, they have to keep 20% of this number. Remember that number changed, okay, but now they have to keep 20% of that number. So by keeping 20% of that number, how much do they now have to have here? All right, that's step 2. Step 3 then is to change the excess reserves accordingly. So again, you change your required reserves by a certain amount. The rest of it is going to get changed into excess. Let's look at an example because that's the best way of doing it. So here I've got the same chart that was up here down here. Someone deposits $5,000 into their checking account. So we started, remember, at 20,000. So step 1 is to change this number here. So we go from 20,000 and now they have 25,000. Okay. Step 2, figure out how much they have to have in required reserves. Okay. So of the 25,000, they have to keep 20% or 1/5. So they have to keep 5,000. So this number goes from 4,000 to 5,000. So this number increases by 1,000. Now remember our rule, the two sides have to balance, right? So if we add 5,000 over here, how much do we have to add over here total? That's right, 5,000. So we've added 1,000 so far. Where does the other 4,000 go? Immediately, it goes into excess reserves. So our excess reserves increase from 2,000 to 6,000. And if you notice, life is good yet again because the two sides balance. Add up all these numbers, 25,000, and that equals the 25 over here. So remember to go in that order. If you go in that order, you always end up with the right answer. Number 1, change your deposits, okay, and get that right. Number 2, figure out the required reserves. The rest of whatever changed gets factored out of the excess reserves. So do it that way and you should be good to go. So that's a good example of a bank balance sheet and the kinds of questions they're going to ask on that. Let's talk about the money multiplier. Not too bad as long as you know the formula. So it's the idea of that's possible because of fractional reserve banking. This idea that banks don't keep all of your money when you put it in there. They keep a part of it, like we just learned. The rest of it, what do? They loan it out. As they loan it out, somebody's going to get that money. They're going to deposit it into a bank. The bank keeps a part of that new deposit. They loan the rest out. Somebody gets that money. It gets loaned out again, loaned out again, loaned out again, and so forth, and the money multiplies. Here we go, the money multiplier. So The formula, which is very important, 100 divided by the required reserve ratio, or the RRR. Okay, so if the RRR, the required reserve ratio, is 20%, then we do 100 divided by 20. Now, the way I'm doing it, FYI, for those of you who are math people, my apologies, I'm using the 20 as a whole number. I know that 20% is technically 0.2, so if that bothers you, it would then be 1 over the required reserve ratio, using the required reserve ratio as a decimal. I just like to use it as a whole number. It's a little bit easier, so I do 100 divided by. So FYI, I'm aware of the mathematical problem there. But anyway, 100 divided by 20 using it as a whole number, and our money multiplier then is 5. Okay, really simple. 2 steps to applying the money multiplier. Number 1, you got to figure out the money multiplier, like we just did. Step 2, really simple, multiply the money. Okay, that's why they call it the money multiplier. Now, here's the trick. Okay, you have to pay close attention to what they are asking. Sometimes they ask for the total money supply, and sometimes they ask for the change in the money supply. More often than not, they ask for the change in, okay, but they could ask the other one as well. So, as an example, okay, let me give you a brand new example. The reserve ratio is 25%. Well, let's stop right there and ask, what is the money multiplier? Well, the money multiplier is going to be 100 divided by 25, and so that's going to be 4. Okay, and then the question is, based on how we ask it, okay, if someone deposits $10,000 into the bank, then what is the total money supply? Well, you take the money multiplier of 4, multiply it by the new deposit of $10,000, and you get $40,000. Okay, if they ask the change in the money supply, then it's $30,000. Okay, so let me show you again, just step by step, how I got those answers. So the first one, when they're asking about the total money supply, I kind of did that with you. Money multiplier is 4, like we said, 100 divided by 25. Then you multiply 4 times the $10,000 deposit, and you get the $40,000. But if they ask for the change in the money supply, we have to subtract out the original $10,000 because it was already there, part of M1. Remember, because M1 consists of cash and checking accounts. So the $10,000 is already there. So essentially, we go from $10,000 to $40,000. So our change in the money supply is $30,000, or the difference between those two. Okay, so pay close attention to how they ask that, because they'll ask it different ways to try to trip you up, but that's the basic idea. So the money multiplier, pretty simple. All right, money markets. Okay, the money market measures the supply and demand for money, and this creates our nominal interest rate. Remember, the money market, it's the nominal interest rate, in the loanable funds market, which we're going to see in a second, is real interest rates. Okay, but this is nominal. So the money, which curves we got? So the supply of money is a vertical line because essentially money is a constant. There's a certain amount of money in the economy at all times. It doesn't really matter what the interest rate is. Okay, it is has nothing to do with the interest rate. Okay, it's whatever the Fed decides they want it to be. Okay, at any given time. So that's why it's a vertical line and it's constant. And the key is only the Federal Reserve can impact the money supply. That's why I put the Fed up here. They're the only ones that can either put money in the economy or take it out and make that number shift. Okay, make that curve shift, I should say. And of course, if they put money in the economy, right? So the money supply curve shifts to the right, look like that. If they put money in the economy, if they take it out, it shifts to the left. Okay. All right, so that's the supply of money curve. The demand for money curve is downward sloping. The idea is pretty simple. If interest rates are high, people will not want to borrow money because it's expensive to borrow money. So they're not going to borrow money to buy homes, cars, things like that. So there's going to be less of a demand for money because if you're not buying these things, you don't need money to buy those things. As interest rates drop, however, people do want to buy more of those interest-sensitive expenditures, and so they will demand more money as a result of it. So again, I know I've said this before in class, don't think of it as how badly people want that money. People's desire for money is insatiable. That's not what it's measuring. It's measuring, in a sense, how much money is needed to buy what we have produced. If we produce $22 trillion in goods, then our demand for money is in a sense, 22 trillion. If we make less than that, then our demand for money goes down. If we make more than that, our demand for money goes up. Again, I always give the example, it's prom time, and it's, okay, Mom, Dad, the dress I want is gonna cost $300, so you go to Mom and Dad and say, I need $300. If the dress you want is $400, you go to mom and dad, say, I want $400, or you'll say $450 because you'll buy some cigarettes with the extra money. But anyway, it's based on what it costs. Okay, so kind of think of it that way. Bottom line is it's downward sloping, and the government impacts money demand. Now, I'm not saying, don't confuse this. I'm not saying the government is the only thing that can ever affect money demand. There are other things that can affect demand for money, but as we weigh fiscal and monetary policy, which is the most common type of question you're going to get, you think of it as the Fed, which is pretty much the only thing that can affect money supply, but the government affects money demand, even though there are other things that can affect demand for money. Okay, they're not the only one. Again, don't misunderstand me there, but as they ask you questions about monetary and fiscal policy, that's what it's going to come down to. Okay, and of course they shift right and left and change equilibrium interest rates. All right. Let's look at loanable funds market. Now remember, loanable funds, we've got real interest rates, okay, because we're talking about money over time, so the inflation changes over time, so that affects the rate of return you're getting in real terms. So that's why it's not nominal, it's real. But again, it basically measures the supply of loanable funds, which is how much money is available to be borrowed, and the demand for loanable funds, how badly those people want to borrow that money. And then, of course, the intersection creates our equilibrium interest rate and quantity of loanable funds. So the supply, remember now, on the graph we just looked at, the money market graph, supply of money is a constant. Not true with the supply of loanable funds. It's upward sloping, because if interest rates are low, it does not give you much of an incentive to part with your money, to save your money, or put it in a bank, or into an investment or something like that, because you're saying, I'm not getting much of a return. I'd almost rather spend it now. Interest rates are low. I can get a good deal on a home. I can get a good deal on a car. So people are less likely to be willing to part with their money and make it available to be loaned. All right, but as interest rates go up, all of a sudden it makes more sense to want to give your money to a bank or other institutions so that they can loan it out. And so as interest rates go up, you're going to find that loanable funds, the supply of loanable funds increases. So it's really upward sloping like any normal supply curve that we've done. Now, the Fed isn't the only institution that can affect the supply of loanable funds. Again, on a question, they're the most likely one that's going to affect that. There have been other questions we've seen where there's capital inflow and things like that coming from other countries, but mostly it's the Fed. If they impact the supply of money, it's going to impact the supply of loanable funds accordingly. Okay, an increase in money supply increases supply of loanable funds and vice versa. Demand for loanable funds, same rationale as why the demand for money is downward sloping. High interest rates, people don't want to borrow money. As interest rates go down, people are more willing to borrow money. So it's downward sloping curve. Here, the one question most likely to get is the government engaging in deficit spending. They love to ask what's going to happen when the government engages in deficit spending. Well, the government needs to borrow money to spend. That's going to increase the demand for loanable funds. Okay, and most importantly, that's going to increase interest rates. Okay, if the government did the opposite, if they stopped, if they wanted to balance their budget or stop deficit spending, it would decrease the demand for loanable funds because they're not in the economy taking up all the loanable funds. So you would see demand for loanable funds decrease and interest rates come down. Otherwise, it pretty much, again, if you know that the Fed is primarily affecting supply of loanable funds, the government is primarily affecting demand, and just shift accordingly, you'll get your shift. And in a second, we'll talk about how interest rate changes affect long-term growth and things like that. All right, let's talk about the Fed and monetary policy. So the Federal Reserve. Remember, we're not going to go into all the nuances of what the Fed is, a decentralized central bank and all that kind of stuff. Just basically know that they are independent of the government. So remember, the Fed is not saying the government. This is a separate institution, not controlled pretty much in any way by the government. Their goal is to monitor the economy and either put money in or take it out in order to stabilize both inflation, to make sure that inflation isn't getting too high or too low, and try to keep employment levels stable as well. Watch the unemployment rate. And this, of course, both those go back to the Phillips curve, which we've already done. So by changing the money supply, they influence interest rates in the economy, and this is the most important thing. There is an inverse relationship between the money supply and interest rates. Let me come back to my money market graph, and that's pretty easy to see. If the Fed increases the money supply, like I showed you a moment ago, remember this curve shifts to the right. Notice what happens to interest rates. Interest rates go down. The same would be true on a loanable funds graph if you wanted to use that one to show this, okay? If the Fed does the opposite, if they take money out of the economy, okay, it's going to make interest rates go up. So money supply goes up, interest rates go down. Money supply goes down, interest rates go up. Inverse relationship between the two. Now, how does the Fed put money in and out of the economy? Well, they got the three tools, okay, that we talk about. So the first one is reserve ratios. Reserve ratios, which we did a moment ago, will affect the money multiplier, and that affects how much money can either be expanded or not in the economy. So if they increase reserve ratios, and just do a simple money multiplier formula to figure this out, but if they increase reserve ratios, it makes the money multiplier smaller, which decreases the money supply. Less money is available to be loaned if banks have to keep more of it. And if they decrease reserve ratios, if they allow banks to loan out more money is going to be out there in circulation being spent. So it increases the money multiplier and increases the money supply. So they can use that. They're probably unlikely to, but they can. Second one is changing an important interest rate called the discount rate. The discount rate is the interest rate the Fed charges on loans to banks. Remember, banks sometimes have to borrow money from the Fed, especially if their reserves are not up to par. By law, they have to keep a certain amount of reserves at all times based on their deposits. If they don't have enough, they need to get that from somewhere. They can borrow from other banks. That's called the federal funds rate, the interest rate banks charge each other. The discount rate is the interest rate the Fed charges on money, on loans, things like that to banks. So if they lower the discount rate, if it's cheaper to borrow money from the Fed, more banks are likely to borrow money from the Fed. And if they do that, then banks have more money to spend, and so it will increase the money supply. On the other hand, if they raise the discount rate, banks are less likely to borrow money. If money's not coming in from the Fed, then it decreases the money supply. Okay, so it kind of works that way. Kind of the same with think of the discount rate as an interest rate, and it goes opposite with the money supply. The one, however, they are most likely to use is open market operations, the buying and selling of securities in the economy. Okay, bonds and treasury notes and bills and things like that, other securities. So the key thing here is pretty simple. Remember, when the Fed buys bonds, I always think of it this way, keep it simple. When you buy something, do you give money or do you get money? You give money, right? You go to McDonald's and you buy a value meal and you give them money. McDonald's gets money. You get the value meal, they get the money. When the Fed buys, the Fed is giving money to the economy. Always remember, think of it this way. When the Fed's holding money, it is not in the economy being spent. Okay, so they're holding it here. If they buy, it puts more money in the economy, increases the money supply. If the Fed sells, think of when you sell something. You're holding your garage sale, and you sell that old ping pong table that nobody uses anymore, which is unfortunate. What happens? You get the money. When the Fed sells bonds, they get the money. Money is taken out of the economy because it goes to the Federal Reserve. Okay, so that's how they use open market operations to either increase or decrease the money supply. And like I said, of the three, they use it most often. Now, when do they use monetary policy? Well, it depends on what's happening in the economy, just like with fiscal policy. Okay, kind of depends on what's going on. If we're in a recession, okay, bottom line is the Fed's going to want to pump money into the economy. Putting money into the economy hopefully gets people spending again and businesses hiring and this and that. And so they will engage in what's called expansionary monetary policy, primarily by buying bonds. That puts money in the economy with the goal of increasing aggregate demand, putting more money in people's pockets and in banks. The banks can loan them out and whatnot, and so it increases aggregate demand. If inflation is high, and that's their concern, what do? They take money out of the economy. Okay, by taking money out of the economy, it decreases aggregate demand, takes money out of people's pockets, and chills things out, and that'll bring, hopefully, inflation down. So that's typical of what the Fed would do at any given time in the economy. And then lastly, just a real quick reminder of how interest rates affect investment and how they affect long-term growth. So when interest rates are low, businesses have more of an investment to expand. Universal Studios is more likely to borrow money to build a brand new theme park in addition to Islands of Adventure and Universal Studios. Disney is going to build a new Star Wars park, part of the park, whatever. So businesses are going to build new factories, put additions onto their factories. So things like that. So when interest rates are low, it's easier to borrow money. Businesses are more likely to borrow money and use that to expand by investing in capital purchases such as new factories, technology, and things like that. Now, if businesses have built new factories and they've put money in research and development and new technology, guess what? We're going to have greater potential growth in the future. Because of that, we can make more things because we've expanded our capital stock. On the other hand, when interest rates are high, businesses are less likely to borrow money to build that new factory, to build that new theme park, to build that new line, to invest in that technology. And if they're not doing these things, there's going to be slower future growth. Not necessarily, I know we want to say negative because we want to go opposite. We say positive future growth here, negative future growth there. It's not necessarily a negative per se. It's just slower is probably a better way of saying it. We're probably still going to grow, but just not as much as we would if we had these new things. Okay? So understanding that helps you understand the concept of crowding out. This is one of the drawbacks of fiscal policy. Let me go back real quick again to our money market graph. You can use the loanable funds graph. That's probably a better one here. So remember, come back here. If the government was going to spend money like they are right now to help boost the economy. What's the goal of spending money? To boost aggregate demand. But they don't have $2 trillion sitting around to spend on the stimulus. What are they going to do? They're going to borrow. As they borrow, it increases the demand of loanable funds, like I showed you just a moment ago. And again, it makes interest rates go up. Interest rates, so again, the goal is to put money in people's pockets to boost aggregate demand. The problem is when interest rates go up, businesses are less likely to borrow money to expand, and so that part of aggregate demand, remember 4 parts to aggregate demand: consumption, investment spending, right here, government spending, which is what we just talked about, and net exports. So crowding out is kind of the idea that there is a canceling out effect, okay, or counterbalancing effect to expansionary fiscal policy. And just like it says, the government engages in deficit spending to increase the demand for loanable funds and makes interest rates go up. Businesses are less likely to invest. That decreases that component of aggregate demand and GDP and can negatively impact future growth. So crowding out is that idea that the government is spending. It's not having as much of an impact as maybe they had hoped or wanted to. Okay, so the idea, bottom line is, though, you will see that come up where they talk about how interest rates affect future growth. Lower interest rates tend to lead to greater future growth. Higher interest rates, less future growth. So there you go. Again, I know that's a lot we just talked about. That's a mouthful, a lot of concepts there, but hopefully that gives a quick overview and some help. If you needed a refresher on that, as always, let me know if you have any questions. And until next time, behave yourselves.